A millionaire accepts a bet to marry an overweight woman who defies his standards. What begins as a game of power and control soon takes an unexpected turn. Bryan Chapman was the kind of man who believed the world revolved around him and that he could get anything he wanted. Known as the typical conqueror, his fame came not only from his fortune, but also from the stunning women who always accompanied him. He had a very specific type: tall, slim, sophisticated women who looked like they'd just stepped off a magazine cover. Nothing less than that attracted him. As Bryan moved through the room, savoring the attention he was receiving, his eyes met those of Roger Villarreal, his lifelong friend and partner in countless parties and adventures. Roger smiled in a way Bryan knew well, a smile that always preceded a provocation or an impossible challenge. Always surrounded by the most beautiful, as expected, Roger began with a mocking laugh. They say you never miss an opportunity to outdo yourself. But honestly, it all seems so predictable. Bryan raised an eyebrow, intrigued but guarded. Predictable? What do you mean by that? Roger shrugged. I just follow my standards. I like quality, yes. And what high standards you have, Roger teased, giving him a challenging look. Everyone here knows that you're only interested in women who could be runway models. For you, everything in life is a matter of aesthetics, right? The friends around them began to laugh, exchanging complicit looks. Everyone knew Bryan had a specific and rigid type, and it was nearly impossible to imagine him stepping out of that comfort zone. Roger, seeing he had everyone's attention, decided to play his last card. Let's make a bet then, Bryan. One that will really test your skills and your taste. Bryan smiled ironically. Go on, Roger. You know I love a good challenge. Roger leaned in closer, his voice filled with malice. I bet $1 million that you don't have the courage to marry a woman who doesn't fit your perfect standards and stay with her for at least 6 months. No thin, elegant models. I'm talking about a real woman with curves who is completely outside of your ideal. Bryan swallowed, but kept the smile on his face. He knew Roger was trying to provoke him, testing the limits of his pride and vanity. $1 million for 6 months of marriage? Sounds like easy money, Roger. Who would this mysterious woman be? Roger looked across the room and subtly gestured toward a woman who stood out not for fitting in, but for being far removed from the stereotypes Bryan adored. Mary Taylor was in a conversation group, laughing openly without caring about the eyes on her. She was a robust woman with a warm smile, intelligent eyes that shone, and a natural confidence that radiated strength. Mary didn't fit any of the molds Bryan was used to. She was bold, authentic, and very different from the women he usually pursued. Mary Taylor, Roger said with a triumphant smile. She's the opposite of everything you've always valued, a woman who doesn't care about expensive dresses, diets, or aesthetic standards. And you know the best part? She's not the least bit impressed by your money. The laughter of the friends around almost made Bryan lose his composure. He was used to being challenged, but never in a way that openly questioned his vanity and personal preferences. Roger's gaze was a mix of provocation and anticipation. He knew he had touched a sensitive nerve. Do you think I can't win over a woman like Mary? Bryan asked, his tone defiant. Is that what you're saying, Roger? Roger laughed loudly, making sure everyone could hear. Not only do I think it, Bryan, I know it. You're too predictable, my friend. Everything you do is based on appearance, but to win this bet, you'll have to play a completely different game. And I doubt you're up for it. Bryan felt his ego was being challenged in a way he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about money, it was a matter of honor, of proving he wasn't predictable or limited. Very well, Roger, Bryan said with a calculated, dangerous smile. I accept your challenge. 6 months is enough time to make any woman, including Mary Taylor, fall for me. Get your check ready, my friend. The crowd around, which had been hanging on every word, erupted in applause and laughter, eager to see how this story would unfold. Satisfied with the provocation, Roger raised his glass and toasted to Bryan, knowing that, regardless of the outcome, he had sown a seed of intrigue that would not easily fade. But as Bryan left the room, an uncomfortable feeling unsettled him. He might have accepted the bet to protect his pride, but he knew Mary Taylor was not an ordinary woman. She wasn't the type to be impressed by wealth or superficial charm. For the first time, Bryan wondered if he had made a mistake by underestimating the real challenge before him. Bryan Chapman had always been in control. To him, life was a game of manipulation, power, and conquest. In his mind, no one could resist his magnetic charm or the overwhelming influence of his wealth. But that night, as he prepared for his first meeting with Mary Taylor, he felt a kind of anxiety he wasn't used to. He chose an exclusive restaurant in Puerto Madero, one of Buenos Aires' most elegant neighborhoods, where the panoramic windows offered a spectacular view of the river and the city lights. It was the kind of place that screamed sophistication and status, perfect to impress someone. Or so Bryan thought. When Mary entered the restaurant, Bryan was briefly at a loss for words. She was not like the women he usually brought to that place. Mary was dressed simply yet elegantly, without the luxurious dresses or elaborate makeup he was used to seeing on his companions. She exuded a quiet confidence, a gaze that seemed to see beyond the facade of luxury and looked directly into the essence of people. Mary walked over to the table and, without hesitation, sat across from him. Bryan stood up to greet her, offering a calculated smile that usually disarmed anyone. But Mary simply raised an eyebrow, an expression mixing curiosity and slight disappointment. "Mary Taylor," he said with a smile, trying to conceal his unease. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Bryan Chapman," she replied directly. "I'm sure it is, for you." Her dry, sarcastic response caught Bryan off guard. He was used to encounters where he set the pace, but Mary seemed prepared to dismantle each of his charms with the same ease he offered them. "You chose a nice place," Mary continued, glancing around at the refined surroundings with a complete lack of wonder. "I imagine you're used to places like this. Personally, I prefer something simpler, where conversations are real and intentions are clear." Bryan felt his confidence waver for a second. This wasn't the kind of meeting he'd expected. Usually, he could dominate the conversation, guide emotions, and manipulate expectations. But Mary didn't seem willing to play his game. He leaned forward, deciding to adopt a more sincere posture, or at least something that seemed sincere. "Mary, I know you're not like the other women I've met, and I respect that. But tell me, why did you accept this date if you're not interested in impressing or being impressed?" Mary held his gaze, as if searching for something beyond the man that everyone else saw. "Because I like meeting people who pique my curiosity," she replied. "And you, Bryan, are a mystery to me, a man who bets $1 million on a temporary marriage." I couldn't resist the temptation to see what makes someone care so little for another's life as to treat it like a wager. Bryan swallowed, keeping his smile, though now a bit more uncertain. "I never meant to offend you, Mary. This bet is just a way to test my limits, you know? To prove to myself that I can win over anything I want. And that's what you think I am, isn't it?" Mary interrupted, crossing her arms. "A thing? Something that can be conquered? Well, let me make it easy for you. I am not a thing, Bryan. I am a person with my own goals and principles, none of which involve being a trophy in your game." Bryan felt the impact of her words, as if hit by a wave of reality he'd never experienced before. He had always seen himself as the master of situations, but at that moment, he felt small in front of Mary's clarity and strength. It was as if everything he believed he had under control was slipping through his fingers. If we're really going to continue with this, Mary went on, her voice steady, but now with a touch of defiance, I want to make something very clear. I'm not interested in your money, your influence, or your world of luxury. I don't need your money, Bryan, and I don't want it. I accepted this situation out of curiosity to see who you really are behind the masks and the facade. Bryan managed to smile, though this time it was more genuine, mixed with a hint of frustration. Very well, Mary. Let's take off our masks then. Let's see who we really are. Mary nodded but didn't smile. And one more thing, Bryan, I want it to be clear that even though we're entering this agreement, I won't be controlled by you. I have my own life, my own plans, my work, my friendships, and that won't change for a temporary marriage. She paused, looking directly at him, as if evaluating his reaction. Bryan leaned back in his chair, feeling both surprised and intrigued. He was used to women who adapted to his lifestyle, who sacrificed everything to please him. But Mary was playing a completely different game. So, to be clear, Mary continued, if you accept these conditions, we'll sign the agreement. But you should know that at the end of these 6 months, we'll go our separate ways. No hard feelings, no drama. Just a fulfilled contract. Then we have a deal, he said, trying to sound more confident than he actually felt. I respect your terms, Mary. 6 months, you stay yourself, and I won't try to control you. But I'll tell you one thing, you intrigue me like no one ever has. Don't get too excited, Mary replied, taking her glass of water and looking at him with an enigmatic smile. I'm not here to be conquered, Bryan. I'm here to see just how far you're willing to go. Mary then took a document from her bag that she had prepared. It was a contract with all the terms clearly defined. Bryan took the document and read each line carefully, noticing that Mary had specified each condition in detail. Without hesitation, he signed it, sealing the agreement with the smile of someone who knew they were about to step into unknown territory. Now that everything is clear, can we eat? Mary asked with an ironic smile on her lips. I've heard the food here is excellent. Bryan laughed, more to himself than to her, feeling a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine respect and the sensation of a real challenge. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere was different. Mary had made it clear from the beginning that this wasn't a romantic date, but a duel of wills. She was an adversary Bryan hadn't expected, a woman who was not for sale and who was not impressed by the shine of his world. When the night finally came to an end, Bryan escorted Mary to the door of the restaurant. He hoped to find some softness in her gaze, a hint that his words had had an effect, but all he found was the same calm and controlled expression. Good night, Bryan, Mary said, giving him a firm handshake without hesitation. Until next time. He watched her walk away, wondering if he had finally found a challenge he didn't know how to conquer. For the first time in his life, Bryan Chapman felt like a player caught in his own game, and the feeling was both terrifying and exciting. As Mary disappeared into the Buenos Aires night, Bryan knew this encounter was just the beginning. The real game had only just started, and he was more determined than ever to discover what it would take to win over a woman who wouldn't bow down to anyone. Days later, in a discreet and practically empty courthouse in Buenos Aires, Bryan and Mary got married. There were no guests, no music playing, and the judge seemed more interested in finishing quickly to get to lunch. Bryan wore an impeccable suit, as if he were at a business meeting, and Mary, in her simple dress, looked more like a participant in a trial than a bride on one of the most important days of her life. The judge recited the formal words, and they both responded mechanically. When it came time for Mary to place the ring on Bryan's finger, she did so with calculated calm, without any emotion in her gaze. Bryan, accustomed to grand ceremonies and exaggerated declarations of love, felt the impact of the cold, distant moment. When the judge finally declared them husband and wife, there was a brief moment of silence. Bryan expected Mary to make some sarcastic comment, but she simply gave him a slight nod as if to say, "It's official now." Then she turned and began walking toward the exit without even waiting for him. Standing in the center of the empty courtroom, Bryan felt a mix of frustration and fascination he couldn't explain. Nothing about that woman was predictable, nothing about her fit into his conventional molds. He had always thought he could control any situation or person, but now he realized Mary was the exception. Outside the courthouse, the chauffeur waited to take them home. Bryan opened the door for Mary, but she declined with a gesture. "I'm going to walk a bit," she said. "I need time to think." He watched as she walked away, strolling along the sidewalk as if she were saying goodbye to a ceremony that was never truly hers. Bryan knew in that moment he had entered a game where the rules changed constantly, and that the real battle wasn't about winning Mary, but discovering who he truly was when everything he knew didn't work. The silence took hold of the car as Bryan Chapman watched Mary Taylor calmly walk away from the courthouse, her determined steps echoing on the sidewalk. She didn't look back even once, which only reinforced the frustration growing within him. Bryan had always believed that money and charm were enough to conquer anyone. But Mary was proving him wrong. Back at Bryan's luxurious penthouse in Puerto Madero, the tension between the two was palpable. Mary walked through the enormous space with disinterest, her eyes examining the expensive artwork and opulent decor without a hint of admiration. For Bryan, this place was a fortress, a symbol of his success and everything he had achieved. For Mary, it seemed like just another luxury trap, something that didn't impress her at all. "Welcome to your new home," Bryan said, trying to sound casual as he watched her every move. "I hope you find comfort here, even if it's only temporary." Mary turned to him, a half smile on her lips. "Comfort, Bryan? This is your world, not mine. I'm not here to settle in or to be conquered. I'm here just to fulfill our part of the agreement." Her words echoed in the silent space, cutting like a knife through Bryan's attempts to keep control. He was used to receiving praise, to hearing people talk about how incredible his lifestyle was. But with Mary, every attempt to dazzle her seemed pointless, a battle he was destined to lose. Bryan crossed his arms, trying to regain composure. "You're truly a woman of principle, Mary. And I have to say, your firmness impresses me. But I still have to ask, what truly motivates you? What is your end goal in all this?" Mary looked at him with a serious and intense expression, as if measuring every hidden intention behind his words. "My goal, Bryan, is simple, to live my life without submitting to anyone's whims. I entered into this agreement out of curiosity, to see how a man who thinks he's invincible deals with the reality of not being able to control everything around him. And so far, I must admit, I'm finding it fascinating." Bryan felt his ego challenged in a way he'd never experienced before. Mary wasn't here for him, or for his money, or for his status. She was there to make a point, to see how far he would go in his attempt to dominate her. He realized that the struggle between them was much more than a game of egos. It was a battle of wills, and he was beginning to savor every moment of it. Determined not to give up easily, Bryan decided to change his approach. He knew his strength lay in his luxurious lifestyle, and he thought that maybe the allure of wealth and comfort would eventually sway Mary. He started showering her with everything he could offer: expensive jewelry, designer clothes, even trips to exotic destinations. He was convinced that the temptation of a millionaire's lifestyle would eventually break down her barriers. "I'll make this experience unforgettable for you, Mary," he said, extending a jewelry box to her. "I know you said you're not interested in my money, but maybe a touch of luxury could change things." Mary took the jewelry box, looked at the sparkling contents, and, with disconcerting calm, closed it and handed it back to Bryan. "I already told you, I don't need this, Bryan. It's not expensive gifts that will get you what you want from me. My worth isn't measured by what I wear, but by who I am." Bryan swallowed, trying not to show the disappointment he felt. He was used to buying people's attention with his money, to being praised for it. But Mary seemed immune to all his tricks. The more he tried to impress her with his lifestyle, the more she reaffirmed her independence and indifference. Frustrated but still motivated, Bryan tried a new tactic. On a sunny afternoon, he invited her to take a ride on his private yacht, anchored in one of Buenos Aires' most exclusive clubs. He was certain that the grandeur and exclusivity of the moment would at least elicit some sign of satisfaction from her. During the ride, as the yacht glided over the calm waters, Bryan cast a glance at Mary, hoping for a positive reaction. But once again, she seemed unbreakable. "So, Mary," he said, trying to mask his frustration behind a charming smile, "isn't this the kind of luxury that might make you reconsider?" Mary turned to him, locking her gaze on his, but this time there was a touch of compassion in her voice. "Bryan, do you really believe this is what defines a full life? Expensive objects, a yacht, a name in high society parties? That's not what moves me. I'm not here to be impressed by beautiful settings or your wealth. I'm here to see who you are when all of this is stripped away, and so far, I still haven't seen that side of you." Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. For the first time, Bryan Chapman felt vulnerable, exposed in a way he had never imagined. Mary wasn't there to fall in love with the powerful man he believed himself to be. She was there to discover the person behind his facade of self-sufficiency. The weeks passed slowly, and despite Bryan's attempts to win this silent battle, Mary remained steadfast in her convictions. She continued with her daily routine, her professional and social commitments, and refused to let Bryan's presence interfere in her life. The contract they had signed wasn't just a formality, it was a silent pact of mutual respect and distance. In the luxury of Bryan's penthouse, the two settled into a distant cohabitation, almost like strangers sharing the same space. While Bryan tried to create situations to get closer, Mary moved farther away, keeping things strictly professional and within the limits of the agreement. She wasn't cold or hostile, but there was an invisible barrier between them that Bryan couldn't cross. One night, as Bryan sat on the living room sofa, Mary walked past him holding a book in her hands. He watched her, realizing that his presence didn't affect her in the way he desired. "Mary, I need to know something," he said, his voice almost pleading. "Will I ever truly get to know you, or will you always keep this distance between us?" Mary stopped and looked at him for a long moment. She took a deep breath before responding, her voice soft but firm. "Bryan, it's not about distance. It's about integrity. I know who I am and what I want in my life." Bryan fell silent, her words echoing in his mind. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, lost, unsure of what to do. Bryan Chapman was exhausted after all his frustrated attempts to conquer Mary Taylor and bend her to his will. He felt like he was reaching a dead end. The frustration and fatigue were overtaking him as Mary continued to challenge him in a way no one else ever had. Determined to change his approach yet again, Bryan resolved to tighten his control, taking the game to a more aggressive level. He started attacking what Mary valued most, her independence. He knew that her career was a fundamental part of her life, and it was precisely there that he planned to strike. Using his power and influence, he began blocking Mary's opportunities, preventing her from going to work and manipulating circumstances to make her increasingly dependent on him. "You really don't need more, Mary," Bryan said one morning with a calculated smile as he blocked the door. "I can take care of all your needs. After all, you're my wife now, and your place is by my side." Mary looked up, her eyes flashing with indignation as she held her bag tightly. "Bryan, do you truly think you can control my life just because we're married?" She replied, her tone cold and filled with disdain. "I'm not your property. I have my own career, my own ambitions." Bryan took a step closer, his smile now laced with an arrogant coldness. "You don't need to wear yourself out working when I can offer you a life of comfort and luxury. Your focus should be here with me." I can give you everything you want if you just let it happen." Determined to make Mary yield, Bryan began sabotaging her commitments and compromising her professional opportunities. If Mary had an important meeting, he would deliberately delay her with trivial excuses. He used his extensive network of contacts to cancel or reschedule crucial appointments, causing her to miss opportunities to excel in her work. Each time Bryan attempted to manipulate her, Mary responded with an unsettling calm, as if she were always one step ahead. Every provocation was met with a calculated retort. Every attempt to control her was met with unwavering resistance. "You're pathetic, Bryan, if you think you can keep me captive in this little game of power," Mary declared, her eyes fixed on his with an intensity that dared him to continue. "You can close doors and move pieces, but I'll never yield to your control." That calmness of Mary, that firmness of someone who anticipated every blow, started to awaken something inside Bryan, a doubt he had never considered before. He had always thought that Mary entered the marriage agreement for practical reasons, perhaps for security or convenience. But now, her unyielding determination made him question her true motives. One night, after yet another failed attempt to manipulate Mary, Bryan found himself alone in his office, staring into the darkness. Thoughts tormented him. Why did she accept the agreement? What does she really want from me? He began piecing together Mary's actions, the way she seemed to always expect more from him, as if she knew something he didn't. Then something clicked in his mind. There was something larger, a hidden motive behind why Mary had entered this game. Determined to get the truth from her, Bryan walked to where Mary was sitting quietly in the living room, as if the chaos around her was irrelevant. "Enough with the games, Mary," Bryan said, his voice low and tense. "I want the truth. Why did you really accept this marriage? I know there's something more, something you're hiding from me." Mary looked up slowly, a mysterious smile appearing on her lips. It was a smile Bryan couldn't tell was of victory or compassion, but it sent a chill down his spine. "Oh, Bryan," she began, her voice soft but as sharp as a blade. "Do you really think this game is just about you? I accepted this marriage for reasons far beyond you or any power you think you have over me." She stood up, moving very close to him, her eyes locked on his with devastating intensity. "There's something you don't know, something that's going to turn your world upside down," Mary whispered, her voice almost like a deadly secret. "And when the time is right, when all the pieces are in place, you'll see that you were never the master of this game. You were always just a piece on my board." Bryan felt the ground shake beneath his feet. The certainty he'd always had in his ability to manipulate and control was crumbling in the face of the cold certainty in Mary's eyes. For the first time, he began to realize that perhaps he was the one being played, that Mary had been playing her own cards from the very beginning. Before Bryan could respond, Mary walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of doubt. He knew she was right. He had always underestimated Mary, treating her like just another conquest. But now, she was an enigma he couldn't decipher, and worst of all, he knew the devastating secret she hinted at might be the key to tearing down everything he had built. In the days that followed, Bryan became a man obsessed. He hired investigators, delved into Mary's past, trying to find some clue, some fragment of truth that would reveal the devastating secret she was hiding. But all he found were loose pieces that only added to his unanswered questions. Mary, on her part, continued playing her role with the same calculated calmness. Every smile, every cold look seemed to confirm that she was always 2 steps ahead of him. And with each passing day, Bryan felt the control he'd always held slipping through his fingers, carried away by a wind of intrigue he had never imagined facing. The air between them was charged with tension, as if something explosive was about to happen at any moment. Bryan knew Mary was preparing to reveal something that could destroy all his convictions. And despite all his power and control, he was completely at her mercy. While Bryan awaited the inevitable revelation, something became clear. He was facing an opponent he could never underestimate. The game he thought he controlled was about to turn into a battle that would require much more than tactics and manipulation. What Bryan didn't know was that Mary's revelation would go far beyond anything he could bear. And when the truth finally came to light, it would destroy him in a way he had never anticipated. Bryan Chapman was on the verge of despair. With every attempt to subdue Mary Taylor, he watched his efforts dissolve like sand slipping through his fingers. Nothing seemed to work, and each of her enigmatic smiles only served to heighten the feeling that he was losing control. Every word she uttered, laden with a mystery he still couldn't decipher, echoed in his mind like an unsolvable riddle. One night, when the silence of the house became unbearable and the shadows felt heavier, Bryan decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed answers. He needed to know why Mary had accepted this marriage and what she was truly hiding behind her impenetrable facade. He walked to the terrace, where he found Mary gazing at the illuminated city. She looked so calm, so composed, as if she had been expecting him. "Mary, enough of the enigmas," Bryan said, his voice trembling with frustration. "I need you to tell me the truth. I know you accepted this marriage for reasons beyond what you've told me. Why are you really here? Say it once and for all." Mary remained silent for a moment, not looking away from the view in front of her. She seemed to weigh each word, as if she knew that the truth, once spoken, would change everything. Finally, she turned to Bryan, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pain and implacable coldness. "Are you sure you want to know the truth, Bryan?" she asked, her voice low and laden with profound sorrow. "Because what I'm about to reveal might destroy the way you see the world and yourself." Bryan didn't respond immediately. He knew he was about to hear something that would change him forever, but he needed to know. He needed to understand the motive behind the deep-seated hatred in Mary's eyes. "Tell me, Mary," he whispered, his voice almost breaking. "I need to know. Please." Mary took a deep breath, as if carrying an impossible burden. When she began to speak, her voice was laden with raw, intense sadness. Bryan braced himself for what was coming next, knowing that whatever Mary was about to reveal would tear apart everything he had known about himself and the world around him. "My father was an honest man, Bryan," Mary began, her gaze fixed on his, her eyes glistening with restrained tears. "He had a small business, a simple shop, but it was everything to him. It was a place where he poured all his dreams, all his hard work and sweat, building that business from nothing with his own hands, day by day, to support our family and give us a decent life." Bryan started feeling uncomfortable, sensing the story was taking a turn he didn't want to hear. "But the land where my father's business stood wasn't his," Mary continued, her voice growing more bitter with each word. "He rented that space, and we depended on it to survive. When you decided to sell the land to an investor, everything fell apart. My father begged you not to do it. He sought you out. He asked you almost on his knees to reconsider, to not take away the only thing that provided for us." Bryan felt his stomach churn, remembering vaguely a desperate man, a request he had dismissed as an inconvenience, something insignificant compared to the profits he could make from that sale. "But you ignored him, Bryan," Mary said, and now her voice was filled with a rage so cold that it made the air around them feel like ice. "You only thought of the money, of the benefit you could gain. You sold the land without a second thought, without caring what would happen to that man standing before you, pleading for compassion. And in doing so, you destroyed everything he had." Mary paused, her hands trembling slightly, trying to maintain her composure as she recounted the most painful part of her story. "My father lost everything, Bryan, the business he poured his life into, the shop that was his pride and his reason for being. All of it disappeared in the blink of an eye. He fell into a deep depression. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He felt like a failure, a man who couldn't protect his family from losing what was rightfully ours." Bryan felt a tear involuntarily run down his face, unable to look away from Mary. Her words were like a chain of iron crushing his chest, shattering his heart. He became so sick, he had no strength left to fight. Mary whispered, her voice breaking with sorrow. And then, one day, he simply left us. Left out of sadness, out of despair, because you took away everything that gave his life meaning. Bryan staggered backward, feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. The guilt consumed him, burning him from within. He remembered that land, that sale he saw as just another strategic move. Never did he imagine he could destroy lives in the process. Mary continued, her eyes now filled with tears and her voice even more unsteady. Bryan saw the pain reflected in her face, a pain so deep it seemed endless. And as if that wasn't enough, Mary went on, her voice almost a whisper, my mother. She couldn't bear the loss of the love of her life. She watched the man she loved waste away, lose all will to live. She let herself be taken by sorrow, and a few months after we lost my father, my mother left us too. Broken-hearted, Bryan, because you destroyed the life she knew. She fell silent for a moment, her body trembling with emotion. Bryan felt each of Mary's words cut through him like a razor, shredding his soul into pieces. But that's not all, Mary continued, her voice barely more than a murmur, so soft it almost disappeared in the night air. A few days after I lost my mother, I discovered I was pregnant. A child, Bryan, a new hope in the middle of all that sorrow. But with the loss of my parents, the stress, and the hardships around me, I lost the baby. Mary's tears finally flowed freely, her pain laid bare. Bryan felt as if his heart had been ripped from his chest. He had never imagined that his actions could cause such devastation, such cruelty. You took everything from me, Bryan, Mary said, her voice filled with a quiet but fierce hatred. My parents, my future, my child. You destroyed my life and left me alone in an abyss of despair. Bryan fell to his knees, staring at the ground, unable to look at the woman whose life he had ruined. He was consumed by a guilt he had never felt before, an overwhelming sensation that he couldn't fix any of this, that there was no redemption for him. Bryan Chapman remained kneeling on the terrace floor, the echoes of Mary's words reverberating in his mind. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The revelation Mary had just shared crushed him like an avalanche, destroying everything he thought he was. The man who once believed he controlled everything was now broken, shattered, realizing that his selfish actions had caused unimaginable pain. The image of Mary's father, pleading with him not to sell the land where his business was located, was like a dagger twisting in his conscience. He vaguely remembered that day when he thought only of the profits he could make from the transaction, ignoring the desperate eyes of that man. Bryan, who always prided himself on being a visionary in business, had never stopped to consider the lives he destroyed in his pursuit of success. As the memories consumed him, Mary watched him, her gaze steady and unforgiving, like a judge before a convicted man who had just been sentenced. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. Her pain was there, exposed, transformed into a flame burning in her eyes. Bryan finally rose, his knees weak and his soul destroyed. He knew words wouldn't be enough. Apologies, promises to change, none of that would heal the suffering he'd caused. But still, he tried to find his voice. Mary, he began, his voice weak and filled with emotion. I didn't know. I never wanted any of this to happen. If I could go back, if I could undo it all, I'd give anything to fix what I did. Mary didn't move, nor did she soften at Bryan's plea. Her expression remained unwavering, the gaze of someone who was not there to forgive, but to make him face the reality of his actions. Do you think you can undo it, Bryan? She asked, her voice laced with sharp bitterness. Do you think your remorse will bring my father back? Do you think your regret will heal the wound that tore open in my heart when I lost my mother, when I lost my child? Her words hit him like a punch to the chest, and Bryan knew he would never feel a greater pain than that. The image of Mary's father, broken and sick, losing the will to live because he chose profit over compassion, was something that would haunt him forever. Mary's pain was now his own, and he felt helpless in the face of his past. When you sold that land, Mary continued, her eyes piercing Bryan's soul, you didn't just take away my father's livelihood. You took away his purpose, his pride. The dignity to look his family in the eye and say that despite all the hardships, he managed to keep us afloat. You destroyed his heart, and when he left, he took my mother with him. Because the love she felt for him was so immense that she couldn't exist without him. Bryan felt a warm tear slide down his face, but he didn't move to wipe it away. He knew Mary needed to see it, needed to feel that he was being stripped of all his arrogance and pride, reduced to a man who was finally recognizing his flaws. "And you?" Mary asked, her voice now barely a whisper, almost gentle but filled with profound pain. "You continued on with your life, continued accumulating your riches, your business triumphs, as if nothing had happened. While I buried my parents and lost the chance to be a mother. You lived your life without looking back, without considering the damage you left in your wake." Those words were the final blow. Bryan realized it wasn't just about Mary or her family. It was about him, about the person he had become over the years. He was a man who thought he could buy anything, control anyone, without realizing that his own soul was decaying in the process. Now, in front of Mary, he was no longer the ruthless Bryan Chapman. He was just a broken man, facing the wreckage of his own life. "I'm not the man you think I am, Mary," he said, his voice almost crumbling, "but I want to be. I want to change, not to win you over or manipulate you, but because I need to be different. I need to be someone who deserves forgiveness, even if I never get it." Mary looked at him for a long moment, an internal struggle evident in her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe, wanted to see genuine change in the man she hated so deeply. But another part, a larger part, knew that the scars Bryan had left were too deep to heal with mere words. "I don't want your apologies, Bryan," she said finally, her voice soft but unyielding. "I want you to feel, to live with this pain every day. I want you to look in the mirror and see the man you've become. Only then, perhaps, can you understand what my family and I endured." She turned away, leaving Bryan alone in silence, in a void that felt infinite. He knew her words were a sentence, a reminder that there was no easy redemption for him. If he wanted to change, he would have to start from scratch, facing his own demons and rebuilding his life from the ashes of what he had destroyed. But something new was growing within him, a somber determination, a desire to be better, not to win Mary back, but to finally free himself from the chains he had forged. He knew that he would have to redeem himself not with empty promises or grand gestures, but with real, honest, and consistent changes. Bryan Chapman was ready to fight, not to win, but to be worthy, to be human. He knew that from that moment on, his path would not be to control the fate of others, but to transform himself. He was willing to face every pain, every obstacle, to carry the weight of his failures as a constant reminder of what he could no longer afford to be. Because deep in his heart, he knew that this was his only chance to find peace, to someday deserve something beyond guilt and pain. And so, in the shadows of that cold night, Bryan Chapman's true rebirth began, not as a powerful, ruthless man, but as someone willing to pay the price for his actions and to fight tirelessly for a new chance to be worthy of the life he had destroyed. Bryan Chapman was devastated. Mary's revelation about the ruin of her family played over and over in his mind like a storm that wouldn't let him rest. Her pained, contempt-filled gaze, her words like blades cutting into his soul, everything he thought he knew about control, power, and victory crumbled under the crushing weight of the truth. He had been the cause of all that pain. His thirst for power and wealth had not only taken Mary's father and mother from her, but also robbed her of the hope of a future she could never have. Mary, the strong, indomitable woman who had come into his life not to be conquered, but to make him pay for the damage he had caused, had been watching him closely. In the days that followed, Bryan tried to approach her, seeking redemption, a way to prove he was willing to change, to be a better person. He followed her around the house, trying to speak, spilling words of apology and regret, hoping she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Mary, please listen to me," he said, almost pleading. "I know what I did is unforgivable. I never understood the extent of the harm I caused. If I could turn back time and change everything, I would. I want to make things right now. Give me a chance to prove I can be someone different. But Mary only looked at him with a cold, cutting stare, as if he were a stranger. The contempt in her gaze was stronger than any words he could say. She didn't yell, didn't raise her voice, but her distance was deafening, and without a word, she would leave him, day after day, growing ever more distant and unreachable. Bryan knew he couldn't fix what he'd broken with words alone. He needed actions that spoke louder than empty apologies. He needed to show Mary that change was not just a promise, but a truth he was willing to live. And so, he made a decision that would transform his life. He began looking for small businesses and entrepreneurs who were on the verge of bankruptcy, men and women like Mary's father, struggling to survive in a world where corporate giants crushed them. Bryan knew he couldn't bring Mary's father back to life, but he could prevent others from experiencing the same pain and despair. He would use his power and fortune to do something different, to create opportunities where once there had been only destruction. He founded an organization dedicated to helping small business owners, offering financial support, consulting, and training so they could rise and thrive. He personally visited each of the businesses his company had once threatened. The hands that had once signed contracts of destruction now extended to help those who were on the brink. In one of those visits, Bryan met an older man who owned a small convenience store about to close due to the same circumstances Mary's father had faced. The man was tired, and his eyes reflected the same despair Bryan remembered seeing in Mary's father's face when he begged him not to sell the land where his business stood. This vision broke something within Bryan. "I've lost everything I had," the man said, his voice heavy with years of struggle and frustration. "They don't care about people like me. To them, we're just numbers on a balance sheet." Bryan looked at the man and saw the ghost of Mary's father in him. In that moment, he knew he couldn't keep living as the man who destroyed lives in the name of profit. In those bitter words, he saw an opportunity to do things differently. Without hesitation, Bryan assured the man that his business would continue to operate and that he would receive all the support necessary to succeed. As Bryan took each step to transform his actions into something meaningful, Mary watched from a distance. She didn't approach him, but neither did she look at him with the same absolute contempt. There was a new spark in her eyes, not forgiveness, but perhaps a hint of curiosity, a flicker of doubt about the sincerity of Bryan's actions. One night, after weeks of watching Bryan tirelessly dedicate himself to helping small business owners, Mary finally decided to speak. She appeared in the room where Bryan was, her eyes shining with a mix of skepticism and something he couldn't quite define. "Do you think fixing these businesses will erase what you did?" Mary asked, her voice soft but laden with deep pain. "Do you think giving money will undo the destruction you caused? Will it bring back the dreams you shattered?" Bryan looked at her, more vulnerable than ever. "No, Mary," he said with a sincerity that made his voice tremble. "I know I can't fix the past. I can't bring your parents back, but I can try to keep others from feeling what you felt. I can use everything I have to give people a chance that I denied your father. And I'm not doing it to win your forgiveness. I'm doing it because it's the only way I can look in the mirror and see something more than an empty man." Mary remained silent for a long time, watching Bryan with an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul. Finally, she released a small sigh, almost imperceptible but full of meaning. It wasn't full acceptance or forgiveness, but it was a start, a sign that maybe, just maybe, she could believe he truly wanted to change. "I don't know if you're capable of redemption, Bryan," Mary said, her voice firm but no longer so cold. "But at least now you're trying. And that's more than I ever thought you would do." Bryan felt his heart tighten. It wasn't the redemption he'd hoped for, but it was a beginning, a small step towards something bigger. He knew he still had a long road ahead, that the wounds he'd caused might never fully heal. But he was willing to fight, not just for Mary, but for every person he had hurt in his relentless pursuit of power. In that moment, as Mary walked away once more, but without the same icy detachment as before, Bryan realized that, for the first time in his life, he truly felt alive. He was transforming into someone better, not because he wanted something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Perhaps, one day, Mary would see that the change was real. The 6 months of the contract were nearing an end, and the tension in Bryan Chapman's mansion was almost palpable. The man once feared for his ruthlessness and his ability to manipulate any situation now found himself in a completely different place, vulnerable, exposed, and desperate for redemption. Mary Taylor, the woman who had come into his life to challenge him and confront him with his darkest truths, was finally changing something within him. Bryan observed Mary every day, trying to find a crack, a small opening to enter her heart. He knew he couldn't force her forgiveness. He would have to earn it with actions, not just words. And so he devoted himself to making his actions gestures of sincerity and real change. He was determined to show that the man she had met at the beginning of the contract was dead, and that in his place, someone entirely new had emerged. 1 week before the contract ended, Bryan organized a special event for small business owners, offering them not only financial support, but also tools to grow without needing the kind of help he had denied Mary's father. He was on stage, talking about the lessons he had learned and how he wished to use his power to make a difference. His eyes met Mary's in the crowd, and he saw something different in her, something softer, less hardened. After the event, Mary approached him. For the first time, there was no coldness in her eyes. She looked at him with a mix of relief and an emotion Bryan had never seen before. "The truth is," Bryan said, his voice wavering with emotion, "I changed because you showed me who I really was. And I couldn't keep living as that man. I hurt you in ways I can never undo, and I know I may never deserve your forgiveness. But here I am, willing to do whatever it takes." Mary looked at him for a few seconds, fighting against her own emotions. This was the same man who had once ruined her family's life, and now he stood before her, stripped of all his armor, offering her his heart. Bryan felt tears in his eyes, but a small, genuine smile appeared on his lips. "I hated you so much, and somehow, against all odds, you managed to show me that there's still goodness in you," Mary said, a soft tone in her voice. "I forgive you, but not for your actions or words. I forgive you because I, too, have changed, and I feel that we're ready to leave the past behind and try again." Bryan felt an indescribable relief wash over him, as if he could finally breathe after so long. Without thinking twice, he embraced her gently, holding her as if she were the greatest gift life had given him. Mary didn't resist. Instead, she nestled into his chest, allowing herself to feel the safety she never thought she'd find with him. The contract was almost over, and the tension in Bryan Chapman's mansion was palpable. The man who had once prided himself on his ability to control anyone and anything was now a man ready to accept that true power lies not in control, but in understanding and compassion. And thus, Bryan and Mary embarked on a new journey together, not as adversaries, but as partners, willing to build something true and enduring. Breaking the original contract was a symbolic gesture, indicating that the past was behind them. They made a promise to each other to build something genuine, honest, and without secrets. Several months later, as winter began to give way to spring, Bryan and Mary held a small, intimate wedding ceremony. Surrounded only by those who truly mattered to them, there were no exaggerated luxuries, just love and sincere promises of a different future. The man who once thought he could buy anything now understood that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased, but had to be earned with the heart. As time went on, Bryan and Mary enjoyed a serene love, one that grew stronger each day. They were companions and confidants in every aspect. Then, one day, an unexpected piece of news brought a new wave of joy into their lives. Mary had been feeling strange, with constant dizziness and nausea. Worried, Bryan insisted she see a doctor. When the results came in, Mary sat beside Bryan, her eyes shining with a mix of surprise and happiness. "Bryan," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I'm pregnant, and it's twins." For a moment, Bryan was in shock, unable to process her words. When he finally understood, a broad, genuine smile spread across his face. He embraced Mary with such joy that it seemed his heart might burst. "Twins," he repeated, laughing and crying at the same time. "We're going to have twins." Mary, equally moved, smiled as Bryan held her with a tenderness she had never imagined he was capable of. The news was more than he had ever dreamed of. A man who had once felt empty and consumed by control was now filled with hope and love for his new family. At that moment, with Mary in his arms and the promise of new life growing within her, Bryan knew he had found the true meaning of happiness. It wasn't power or money or conquest, it was love, family, and the certainty that, despite all the mistakes and pains of the past, he had found redemption and a future worth fighting for every day. The man who began as a cold, calculating conqueror was now a passionate husband and soon-to-be devoted father, ready to face anything to protect and love those who mattered most to him. Together, Bryan and Mary didn't just restart their lives, they began writing a new chapter, filled with hope, love, and, most importantly, a real new beginning. And you, what do you think? Did Mary make the right decision in forgiving and marrying Bryan? Share your opinion in the comments. We want to know what you think. Your participation is very important to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more narratives like this. Thank you for watching.